Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Emily Shapiro, and I am the executive editor of the journal American Art, as well as the academic programs advisor in the Research and Scholars Center of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the 27th Annual Eldredge Prize Lecture, and I will just quickly stop to ask anyone who has not done so already to remember to silence your cell phone. We are webcasting this event, both live webcasting it, and we'll have it on our website for future, but we don't want phones recorded along with Dr. Lyford's voice, so thank you. Today, we're delighted to be honoring Dr. Amy Lyford of Occidental College in Los Angeles, whose recent book, Isamu Noguchi's Modernism, Negotiating Race, Labor, and Nation, 1940 to 1950, published by the University of California Press, is the winner of the 2015 Charles C. Eldredge Award. The Eldredge Prize is granted annually for distinguished scholarship in the field of American art. A cash prize of $3,000 is made to the author of a recent book-length publication that demonstrates originality and thoroughness of research, excellence of writing, and clarity of method. Named in honor of the former director of this museum, the award was initiated in 1989 with the generous support of the museum's American Art Forum patron support group. Special thanks go to the American Art Forum, as well as to the panel of 3 esteemed jurors who selected the winner for this year's prize. This year's jurors were Julia Bryan Wilson, who is an associate professor of modern and contemporary art at the University of California, Berkeley; Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw, who's an associate professor of American art and the undergraduate chair of the Department of the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania; and Kevin Murphy, who is the Eugenie Prendergast Curator of American Art at the Williams College Museum of Art. Finally, I'd like to thank SAAM staff members Elise Luthi, Carlos Parada, and the museum's Research and Scholars Center staff, especially Christine Hennessy and Marie Ladino, for facilitating today's program, the webcast, and the reception that will follow Dr. Lyford's lecture. I hope you'll join us for refreshments after the talk. And I did want to take this opportunity up front to also put in a little plug for an exhibition of Noguchi's work that will be at the Smithsonian American Art Museum opening on November 11th, 2016, entitled Isamu Noguchi, Archaic Modern. So this was a nice happenstance that this exhibition will be here shortly. Our speaker today is Professor of Art History and Associate Dean of Arts and Humanities at Occidental College, where she teaches courses in modern and contemporary European and American art history and the history of photography. Dr. Lyford received her Bachelor of Arts in Art History from Pomona College, her Master's from Boston University, and her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Her wide-ranging research engages with the history of photography and photojournalism, modern sculpture and architecture, the visual cultures of California and Hawaii, and issues of gender, identity, and race in modernist practice. She's the author of 2 books. The first, Surrealist Masculinities, Gender Anxiety, and the Aesthetics of Post-World War I Reconstruction in France, which was published in 2007 by the University of California Press, and the Eldredge Prize-winning Isamu Noguchi's Modernism, which was published in 2013. In the course of her research on these and other projects, Lyford has been the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Fulbright Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Kress Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council. In Isamu Noguchi's Modernism, Dr. Lyford deftly weaves together archival sources, unrealized works, and more iconic creations to shed new light on Noguchi's distinctive modernist vision. She focuses especially on the shifting cultural and political context in which he developed as an activist and as a socially engaged American artist. In their award letter, the Eldredge Prize jurors wrote this of Lyford's book. This is a lengthy and meaty quote. Tracing the mobility of Noguchi and his work, from institutions like the Museum of Modern Art to an internment camp for Japanese Americans, where he voluntarily lived for over a year during the war, Lyford tells an entirely new story about how art travels and how it might be marked as simultaneously foreign and also American. Her careful account of Noguchi's projects foregrounds the artist's persistent concerns about labor and contributes meaningfully to debates about the role of the artist within a wider economic landscape. Beautifully written and with urgently articulated stakes with regard to racism and citizenship, Lyford's book draws from and contributes to an interdisciplinary set of concerns within Asian American studies, critical race theory, and art history. At heart, it is also a book that grapples with modernism's forms as well as its ideologies to argue for a politics of abstraction. This pioneering book will change how we think about Noguchi, about modernist sculpture, and about American art. Before Dr. Lyford begins her talk today, I'd like to invite her to come forward and accept her prize certificate. Dr. Lyford's talk today, as you see on the screen, which derives from her prize-winning monograph, is entitled Isamu Noguchi, Asia America, and Artistic Identity After World War II. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Lyford.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. It's such an honor to be here today, to be the recipient of the Eldredge Prize. And I want to thank the staff at the Smithsonian for making this possible, for arranging the event. I particularly want to thank Marie Ladino, who has been with me all along the way as we figured out whether there would be snow and I could get here. And the other thing that's really gratifying is to see all of you here today. This is a book I've worked on for about 20 years, if that's possible. And it's really gratifying to realize that my own passion for studying Isamu Noguchi's life and his work is shared by some of you here today. So thank you so much for being here. A vividly modeled metal sculpture and several cryptic archival documents catalyzed my book about the sculptor Isamu Noguchi. Noguchi had hung the abstractly crafted 1934 work Death by a thick rope on a metal armature. It dramatized the effects of lynching on the human body, how the body's arms seem to crisp into edges, and how it dangles from an ordinary rope. The sculpture appeared in 2 anti-lynching exhibitions in 1935 and demonstrates that Noguchi was an artist who wanted to confront social problems head-on. He wanted to use his art to intervene in public life. His 1968 autobiography, A Sculptor's World, revealed him as a complex man with a lasting desire to create social change. In the mid-1930s, Noguchi was active socially and politically in the Artists' Union and the American Artists' Congress. He had created designs for large-scale public works of art and had traveled to Mexico City to work on a public mural project with the help of the painter Diego Rivera. But critics who responded to his work in the 1930s were most influenced by his identification as Japanese. His decision to include a harsh, racially charged review of death in his autobiography attests to its painful effect on him. The critic Henry McBride, echoing other reviews of death, focused on the work's apparent sensationalism. McBride rejected the work as art on the basis of its realism, claiming that Noguchi's, quote, gruesome study of a lynching with a contorted figure dangling from an actual rope may be like the photograph from which it was made, but as a work of art, it is just a little Japanese mistake, unquote. The emphasis on Noguchi's Japanese identity was nothing new. American artists who did not fit the Euro-American norm dominant in the culture at that time were often labeled by their racial or ethnic heritage. Reading Noguchi's autobiography as a graduate student, I recognized the dissonance between his aim to make socially engaged sculpture and the course of his life, marked as it was by his race and national identity. That dissonance emerged powerfully for me as I read about Noguchi's decision to do something after the shock of Pearl Harbor in 1941. Noguchi organized a group called Nisei Writers and Artists for Democracy, and according to him, willfully became a part of humanity uprooted by interning himself voluntarily in the Poston, Arizona camp for Japanese Americans during World War II. First, I wanted to understand why he did that, and what was at stake for him in taking that monumental step. Papers in the National Archives provide information about Noguchi's experience at Poston Camp, and the FBI's file on Noguchi is as revelatory as his autobiography in pointing to a confusing yet deeply compelling element of Noguchi's story. On an unlined index card, someone working for the FBI had typed the following: "It was alleged by a confidential informant that one Isamu Noguchi, formerly of 52 West 10th Street, New York City, was an artist, a communist, and anti-Japanese." What could the statement of this informant mean in regard to Noguchi, his commitment to socially engaged art, and his voluntary confinement at Poston? In two manuscripts Noguchi likely wrote in 1942, the year during which he was at the Poston camp, we can glean a bit of information. In one, he wrote of his belief that artists and architects were the planners of a new and better world, and that if artists did not help create that new world, they'd be relegated to the margins of society. In a second, entitled "I Become a Nisei," he explains that he wanted to reinvent the artist's place in society and therefore decided to go far into the Arizona desert to be locked up with the evacuated Japanese, because he felt this war very keenly and wished to serve the cause of democracy in the best way that seemed open to him. He noted that hardened ideas about race and national identity would impede the building of a new American society in which being hybrid anticipates the future. He recognized, too, that such hybridity, what he called racial and cultural intermixture, was the antithesis of all the tenets of the Axis powers. With this set of concerns in mind, I want to talk to you today not about Noguchi's time in Poston, in the Poston, Arizona camp, which my book covers in great detail, and represented here in two images showing its partially completed state in May of 1942 when Noguchi arrived. I want to talk about Noguchi's work and lived experience in the years just after World War II. Just after the war, Noguchi had two of his most important exhibitions in New York City, at the Museum of Modern Art in 1946 and at the Charles Eagan Gallery in 1949. Both exhibitions and the critical responses to his work help us to understand how the legacy of racialized readings of his work, coupled with increasing wartime stereotyping of Japanese Americans, irrevocably shaped how Noguchi and his art were and continue to be understood. Throughout the 1930s, critics typically commented on what they viewed as the so-called Oriental nature of his work, an assumption based on the fact that he was a mixed-race person. In this image, published in October 1946, Harper's Bazaar describes him this way: Noguchi, one part Italian, one Irish, and 2 parts Japanese, looks dynamic, subtle as his own sculptures, is currently devoting considerable thought to community planning. Although early criticism emphasized his Japanese ancestry, that emphasis increased in the late 1940s when the writing about Noguchi invested more fully in the so-called hybridity of his work, its East-West integration of form and aesthetic conception, as well as the purported emergence of his mixed race or Japanese American identity in that work. In post-war America, this situation developed in part from the American public's burgeoning interest in Japanese culture, whether in the form of calligraphy or the practice of Zen Buddhism. In my time today, I will discuss the 2 most important exhibitions of Noguchi's work during the later 1940s. The critical reception of the two bodies of work at MoMA and the Eagan Gallery both depended upon and promoted, in different ways, a central racialized narrative about Noguchi's art and life that persists to this day, and against which Noguchi himself bristled even at the end of a long and distinguished career when he was selected to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale in 1986. In 1946, a little more than a year after the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Noguchi participated in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art called 14 Americans. The show was one of a series of exhibitions of recent American art billed as a window on contemporary painting and sculpture in the United States. After a 10-year absence from the New York exhibition scene, Noguchi showed 15 works, including Kuros, a monumental marble sculpture he had completed in 1945. In light of the recent war with Japan and the US government's internment of Japanese Americans during the conflict, curator Dorothy Miller's decision to include Noguchi in the show suggests that the museum hoped to promote an artistic democracy by including artists of varied cultural and ethnic backgrounds whose work defied the notion of a single overarching artistic trend. As Miller explained in her preface to the exhibition catalog, quote, "These artists are concerned with communication even more than aesthetics. The idiom is American, but there is no hint of regionalism or chauvinistic tendency. On the contrary, there is a profound consciousness that the world of art is one world and that it contains the Orient no less than Europe and the Americas," unquote. Noguchi's presence was likely an attempt by Miller to embody that world of art, for he and his work undoubtedly reflected associations with the Orient, of which she thought the exhibition should speak. Noguchi's career also reflected the diversity Miller wanted the show to highlight, for it encompassed a variety of media and approaches to art making that referenced many cultures simultaneously. In the works Noguchi titled Kuros, My Pacific, and Kachina, his practice easily navigated between the traditions of Europe, the Pacific, and the Americas in ways that underscored Miller's pluralistic agenda. Noguchi's almost 10-foot-tall marble Kuros, however, reads pretty easily as a descendant of its ancient Greek namesake. Its vertical organic form has a vestigial head and is similarly over life size. Unlike the Greek model, though, the work has an open, polished ribcage that enframes space instead of displacing it. Built of interlocking slabs of marble rather than carved from a single block of stone, Noguchi's sculpture reinterprets the ancient Kuros figure as an attenuated skeletal form. Yet if Kuros follows the Greek tradition in size, verticality, and name, it diverges from that tradition because it is an aggregate of visibly interconnected parts rather than a single unified body. Kuros is also more pointedly pessimistic in tone. With its bone-smooth surface and central cavity, the sculpture displays none of the traditional predecessor's robust, idealized unity. Instead, its evacuation of matter at its center and the open skeletal structure suggests that the ideal Kuros figure has been eviscerated. This difference reveals Noguchi's modernist sculptural technique, the reduction of the body to a system of interlocking parts, for example. And its multi-part interlocking structure makes it portable in ways that the ancient Greek figures were not. Kuros and the other interlocking sculptures he made at this same time could be taken down in just a few minutes. As such a mobile monument, Kuros recast the heroic male figure as a movable effigy, and in ways that subtly mimic the sculptor's own relocations during the late 1930s and early 1940s, including stints in Mexico City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and the internment camp in Poston, Arizona. Noguchi's mobilization of the iconic Kuros form aligns his work with European culture. Yet his version reinvents this cultural signifier of a universal man and raises questions about the liberal ideal of a universal humanity embodied in the ancient tradition. made at a time in the United States when race hysteria and nationalist fervor had brought about the internment of Japanese Americans solely because of their race, the interpretation of this work and others that Noguchi exhibited between 1946 and 1949 reveals the powerful role that stereotypes about race and national identity played in framing how Noguchi and his work were understood in the years after World War II. As I noted earlier, Noguchi's reputation as an artist had been widely understood since the 1930s as one of Japanese and American hybridity. At the same time, the wartime artistic culture in New York was filled with ideas about primitivism and modern art. The New York art world in the mid-1940s commonly repeated myths about modernist art that viewed such work as erasing differences between elite Western cultural traditions and those of so-called primitive cultures of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The painters Mark Rothko and Adolf Gottlieb, for example, proposed that modern Western viewers could readily grasp the meaning and significance of artworks made by non-Western and archaic cultures with no specific knowledge of those cultures or the function of art in them. A sector of the New York avant-garde presumed that art could communicate ideas in a legible visual language that cut with relative ease across national, regional, temporal, racial, and ethnic borders. These powerful cultural and political ideologies shaped American society in the 1940s, and the discourse about modern art that emerged in avant-garde circles during those years typically revolved around a few key issues. The belief that embedding primitive cultural forms in their work could help artists secure a broad and increasingly heterogeneous culturally diverse audience for it, and the reliance on myths of a heroic American modern man who could drive avant-garde culture forward into the modern age. Many abstract artists of the New York School seem to exemplify American freedom and individuality. The heightened sense of spontaneity and heroic energy in their work, coupled with a highly individualized visual style, as in the work of Jackson Pollock, for example, seem to reflect the cultural and political freedom ascribed to American democracy, a democracy of ideas and action, in contrast to the stifling totalitarian cultures of Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany with their state-sponsored propaganda. In this discourse that pitted American cultural freedom against Axis cultural dictatorship in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the artists of the New York School subscribed to the idea that all human beings shared in tragedy, and that primitive and modern man expressed similar experiences of it in their art. Yet for an artist like Noguchi, this concept of art as a potential vehicle for universal communication and understanding must have rung hollow after Pearl Harbor, when Euro-American audiences inevitably labeled the work he and other Japanese-American artists produced as essentially Japanese. In the wake of Pearl Harbor and Japanese-American internment, what were Noguchi's options as an artist who had ambition to be a leader within the contemporary art world? Could he too communicate in a universal language across time, space, and culture as easily as his Euro-American colleagues? Although debates about the creation of a truly democratic American art often elided race to stress universal humanism, a Japanese-American artist like Noguchi knew that after Pearl Harbor, race would invariably be used to define his practice. Indeed, in the late 1940s, viewers of his work often found it difficult to separate his art from his Japanese-American identity. Stereotypes of Japanese Americans did not disappear when the war ended, nor did prejudice against them. Democracy may have beaten fascism abroad, but even with the US military occupying Japan and the American population growing increasingly curious about Japanese culture, many Americans remained ambivalent about the assimilation of Japanese Americans. The critical reception of Noguchi's work in this period reveals how stereotypes of Japan and Asian culture more generally persisted among American art critics, who often reduced his work to familiar cliches about the essentially Japanese or Asian aesthetic of his practice. at the very moment when advanced artists and critics promoted an ideal of universal art and artistic communication, some declared Noguchi's work essentially Japanese, contradicting that same ideal. Noguchi, as a hybrid individual, was both a harbinger of a more inclusive post-war American culture and a celebrated artist whose personal and aesthetic qualities were essentially Japanese. The paradoxical responses to him and his work were not easy to handle, and the persistent racial stereotyping forced him to negotiate competing interests and cultural positions and to reinvent himself continually as an artist and a cultural actor in post-war American life. These were challenges his white Euro-American colleagues in New York typically did not have to face. In 1946 and 1949, Noguchi had two of his most important exhibitions of his life: MoMA's 14 Americans, and in 1949, his one-man show at the Charles Eagan Gallery, which by then was associated with his abstract expressionist painter friends, like Willem de Kooning, who had also showed there. Both exhibitions represent a turning point in Noguchi's career, because the venues were important and because the shows were reviewed by two of the most influential critics at the time, Thomas Hess of Art News and Clement Greenberg of The Nation. Noguchi's work, given such visibility, was poised to join that of the most advanced avant-garde cultural circles in New York. Art history textbooks today present this moment of ascension for Noguchi as part of the history of abstract expressionism, even though his work remains relatively peripheral to that of painters like Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko. Art historian Ann Gibson remarks that Noguchi's position vis-à-vis these abstract expressionists was peripheral, not because of his art per se, although his being a sculptor could have made him peripheral among painters, but because of assumptions about race, national identity, and what made work abstract expressionist. Gibson writes, Noguchi's career sheds light on the intersection of racial stereotyping and the values through which abstract expressionism's ascendancy was established in an era in which his sculpture was at odds with an increasing valorization of immediacy and spontaneity. If it could have been read as calligraphic performance, an expression of Asianness, Americans might have accepted it as abstract expressionism. But because of its highly finished character, Noguchi's sculpture has not been considered eligible for the label of abstract expressionism. Stereotypes of Asian and American styles and the perception that a certain style identified a work as abstract expressionist subtly shaped the reception of Noguchi's sculpture in the 1940s. Had Noguchi's work, as Gibson suggests, been read as a calligraphic performance and an example of spontaneous Asian writing, he might have been accepted as a member of New York's avant-garde. But the Asian references of his sculpture were not Asian enough to pass muster by those who wrote the first histories of the New York School. Published accounts of the works Noguchi showed at MoMA and the Eagan Gallery, however, reveal that Noguchi's artistic choices actually did align his work with an Asian sensibility. But it was not, unfortunately, always the right one, despite his best efforts to make it so with the Eagan Gallery's publicity for the exhibition in 1949. Noguchi did not benefit from New Yorkers' new interest in Asian art, philosophy, and spirituality. Not that he didn't try to mobilize for his own purposes some of the very stereotypes about Japaneseness with which he'd had to contend since the mid-1930s. Thomas Hess's 1946 Art News essay was one of the first extended accounts in the 20th century of Noguchi as an East-West hybrid artist. And his account is the one that has set the tone of scholarship on the sculptor ever since. Hess set forth the visual argument to support his ideas in the first few pages of the essay. There, he located the origin of Noguchi's identity in his half-Japanese and half-Scotch-American parentage, and wove that racially hybrid persona into a story in which Noguchi, quote, carried his exile inside him like his skeleton, unquote. For Hess, Noguchi's hybridity was an unresolved issue. The artist remained forever divided, tethered to two different cultures. At the beginning of his essay, Hess presents photographic comparisons that underscore how East and West fuse in Noguchi's life and art. On page 1, 3 images express the tense yet fragile connection between cultural poles that Hess viewed as key to Noguchi's identity. In the center of the page, the artist's signature has been reproduced to register his presence, and as the title of the review of 14 Americans that we're looking at. This writing is meant to represent a blending, the artist's Japanese name written in fluid black ink, yet in letters of the Latin alphabet that make it legible to Euro-American audiences. None of the social and political context of relations between Japan and America in 1946, however, enters Hess's account. It is perhaps not surprising that Hess would avoid discussing Hiroshima and Nagasaki or the US occupation of Japan. And although he does mention Noguchi's wartime experience in a camp for Japanese Americans, the distrust of propaganda by artists and critics of all stripes, because it had tainted art during the war by mixing it with politics, may have persuaded Hess not to discuss Noguchi's internment in any detail. He was comfortable, however, discussing Noguchi's mixed-race identity. He limited his account to a generic discussion of cultural fusion as an ideal, and the potential of Noguchi's work to speak to a broader humanity. He resolved the political problem of writing about a Japanese-American artist by making the artist's ancestry and mixed-race body metaphors of positive post-war cultural change. His essay gives no inkling of how the artist's Japanese-American identity had been used against him, as it had been against so many others during the war. Hess hints at post-war tensions, but emphasizes how cultural integration may overcome them by using the abstract metaphor of East and West to frame his essay. The photographs above and below the artist's prominent signature, however, propose an image of Noguchi as a bit more Japanese than American on the axis of identity, even as the signature between them westernizes Noguchi. The upper photograph shows him as a 5-year-old living in Japan circa 1910. Noguchi is wearing the costume of an ancient Japanese warrior, a wooden mask and sword, heavy gloves, and padded outerwear suitable for fighting. The image below shows him in 1946, aged 42, at work on a sculpture in his Greenwich Village studio. Together, the photographs suggest key facets of Hess's approach to writing about the sculptor's life and work. First, by pairing the early and midlife portraits of the artist, and by repeatedly referring to cultural fusion and exile, Hess implicitly sets the artist's childhood origins in Japan into a narrative of artistic development. He began as that fledgling Japanese warrior, and he is now a New York sculptor. Subtly, the childhood photograph connects Noguchi with an ancient Japanese tradition, overriding the reality of his Los Angeles birth and pulling Noguchi's identity toward Japan. The text does little to establish Noguchi's national origins in the United States, although Hess notes that he is, quote, half Japanese and half Scotch-American, unquote. His language implies a closer link to the soil of Japan than to that of his birthplace in California. And these are Hess's words. This child, who stares mournfully from behind a wooden mask with his intricate padding and wooden sword, stands barefooted in the pose of an ancient warrior on the sands of Tahahagi. He was born in Los Angeles. His birth in LA notwithstanding, Noguchi emerges here as more Japanese by a series of influences that begin in childhood and extend to the sculptor's memories of the Japanese poems of his father and the months he spent at Poston, Arizona, Japanese relocation camp, Center Number 1. The two photographs reveal that both the warrior child and the sculptor are barefoot. The mournful child plays dress-up war, and the working sculptor in New York is still without shoes. He works with grinders, the tools of Western technology, yet he goes barefoot in the studio as he did when he was a child in Japan. The pictorial logic of these photographs combines with the text by Hess to reinforce an account of Noguchi as somewhat more Japanese than American. Further, the photos also impute to Noguchi the idiosyncratic habit of going barefoot, a penchant that may also conjure up associations with primitivist stereotypes. Hess, alluding to Noguchi's apparent assimilation as a child of the Japanese warrior tradition, surely knew how that reference would play out for some readers. Across the Pacific, US military attacks had destroyed the Japanese war machine, and under US occupation, Japan was pulling itself out of an ancient culture of war as it was introduced to American democracy. The photographic juxtaposition in Hess's essay posits Noguchi as a man caught between Japan and America. A hybrid, yes, but one whose biography exhibits his ongoing transformation from Japanese into American. The artist's signature at the center of the page, which functions as the essay's title, may be where the artist's embodiment of Japanese America actually occurs, for he inscribes it in the letters of the Latin alphabet. The single Chinese character on the following page of Hess's essay represents a different Eastern calligraphy. And to the left of the ideogram is Noguchi's monumental Kuros. Hess's caption for Kuros on this page spells out Noguchi's cultural influences in an apt, if oppositional, comparison. And this is Hess. Climax of 11 years of experimentation and study, Kuros fuses dual traditions of East and West in personal, powerful style. Title and mood come from such archaic Greek sculpture as bronze Apollo or Kuros in Louvre, upper right photograph, of which is from Noguchi's studio. Scheme of construction is inspired by artists' interest in Oriental calligraphy, e.g., copy of Wu Changxi character, lower right. By pointing to the traditions of East and West, however different they appear, Hess fosters the illusion that in Kuros, Noguchi formally integrates two divergent cultural traditions: the over life-size figural sculpture and the diminutive pen and ink calligraphic cartouche. But what are we to think of Hess's assertion that the title and mood of Kuros emanate from the great figural tradition of Western sculpture, while its scheme of construction draws inspiration from Oriental calligraphy? This claim falters for a reader who reflects on the scale of the images, which approximate the relative size of the objects themselves. Kuros, as you can see in this image, is a very large sculpture, 9 feet 9 inches tall. How then could its scheme of construction be so easily compared with a single graphic cartouche that is the size of a thumbnail? The vertical and horizontal marks of the calligraphic sample may superficially resemble the interlocking vertical and horizontal axes of the stone slabs, but the similarity fails to account for Noguchi's process of producing the parts for and constructing his sculpture. Hess's claim misses the mark. Kuros's scheme of construction required physical labor, the use of power tools to carve stone slabs. The completion of the work then required balancing the large, heavy marble slabs and slotting them together without dowels, armatures, or adhesive. Perhaps in its joinery and the fact that the sculpture only becomes a figure when its parts are set in physical relation to one another, does Kuros approach the inspiration of an ideogram whose meaning comes from its connection to other ideograms within language. Yet I don't think that Hess had such lexical contingency in mind when he wrote this essay. Whatever Hess's intentions, his argument is clear: to name as Oriental the structural core of Kuros and attach to it a Western mood. The work remains essentially Oriental, in other words. Does that interpretation imply that as the work goes, so goes the sculptor? Among the challenges of the post-war recovery in the United States, the reintegration of Japanese American internees into society after they left the camps loomed large. Another challenge was to reshape Japanese society from within and transform Japan into an American-style democracy while the US occupied the country. Interactions between the US and Japan increased in the late 1940s, as did Americans' knowledge of Japan. The curiosity of American artists and writers about the art and philosophy of Japan, as the artist Satoru Abe remembers it, stirred up what he called a Japanese craze that gripped New York when he arrived from from Hawaii in 1948 to study at the Art Students League. The release of a new edition of D.T. Suzuki's Introduction to Zen Buddhism, with a preface by Carl Jung in 1949, suggests one element of Japanese culture and society that was being revised after the war. In the early 1950s, among artists and writers in New York, this small book became standard reading. Many American artists and writers at this time were devoured and were influenced by Suzuki's work on Zen, particularly his opposition of a spiritual East to a materialistic West. The American philosopher F.S.C. Northrop, in his book The Meeting of East and West of 1946, extended this oppositional metaphor even as he proposed merging two cultures that seemed to him irreducible. The increasing prominence of East-West dualism and the popularity of Zen Buddhism in the United States in the late 1940s reveals a cultural climate ready for Noguchi's solo exhibition, the first in 14 years, at the Charles Eagan Gallery in March 1949. The exhibition marked the moment in Noguchi's career when, after a long hiatus, he decided to present his work again in the gallery system for, quote, the appraisal of fellow artists, unquote. Noguchi, introduced to Eagan by his friend Willem de Kooning, recalled Eagan as a man artists esteemed highly because he, quote, ran his gallery for artists with no tinge of commerce, unquote. According to Noguchi, the works for the Eagan show emerged from ideas he had begun to explore as he prepared for the MoMA exhibition in 1946. In this exhibition, however, references to the Orient that viewers might recognize were designated by the titles the artist gave his work. He named them with Indian titles like The Gunas and Avatar, and he recalled one small work entitled Rice Field with Insects as a reference to Japan. The exhibition thus included a range of sculptural approaches and materials, and Noguchi acknowledged the Pan-Asian and Western thematics of the work on view there. The surviving installation photograph of the show reveals a conceptual and stylistic disparity between the works that may have been surprising to those who visited the exhibition. Avatar stands tall in the corner, as if perusing the gallery. Nightland on the floor tilts, as if rocking forward and back on its base. Its surface, flat and polished like a table, is set with objects that protrude like knobs or press down on the surface to create convexities. The sculptures attached to the gallery's walls differ in scale, texture, and ambition, in a riot of sculptural possibilities. The works of Noguchi's aesthetic imagination stand, lurch, and hang on the gallery's walls. The oversized avatar looms over the fragile bird's nest on the wall to its right, whose puzzle of thin wooden rods snares small bird-like forms. Most powerfully for me, and one of the most astounding elements of the exhibition, was the Eagan Gallery's framing of Noguchi's work in its publicity materials as emanating from an explicitly Oriental aesthetic. The exhibition catalog, really nothing more than a long sheet of paper folded, accordion style, in wide folds so that ink drawings representing the sculptures on view in the show could fit on a single fold, framed the exhibition as a body of work expressing the Japanese aspects of Noguchi's artistic persona. Organized vertically, like a Chinese or Japanese painting, the catalog unfolded so as to accentuate the Asianness of his practice. Viewers could scroll down the folds to view each page with its object, thus mimicking the viewing of traditional hanging ink scroll paintings. The catalog associates Noguchi's sculpture overtly with calligraphy and ink painting. It reproduces the artist's own ink brush drawings of his sculptures, linking his work, as did Hess a few years earlier, to the practice of traditional calligraphy. And I'm just going to show you, I'm going to kind of scroll us down the page. Each sculpture now reads as an individual character, although the language they refer to is that of Noguchi's sculpture rather than that of the Chinese or Japanese ideogram. These small ink drawings appear to have been made expressly for this catalog, or at least after Noguchi produced the objects they represent, because they all date to 1948, after Noguchi had completed the sculptures. Thus, even if Charles Eagan devised the exhibition's marketing campaign, Noguchi himself must have wanted to highlight the Eastern qualities of his sculptural work. The reproduction of his brush drawings of his sculptures and the folded, vertically oriented paper of the catalog together promote the artist as one whose work drew on Asian sources and traditions. Critics had pigeonholed Noguchi for years by referring to his Japaneseness. But in 1949, he seized on the rhetorical device with which he had so often been framed and made it his own. Yet there is something strange about the visual rhetoric that equates Noguchi's sculpture and Oriental calligraphy so directly, even as Noguchi claims agency by announcing his intention to define his Japanese-American artistic identity. The sculptures have become small ink drawings and have been transformed from three-dimensional objects into small ink cartouches. Retroactively, Noguchi has turned his sculpture into the calligraphy Hess and others seemed bent on finding as the source of his slab constructions. Yet calligraphy is less a source, as it had been in Hess's formulation, than a derivation from his sculptures, effectively turning calligraphic forms into the means by which his sculpture would be read and understood by his audience. His sculpture has become a sign of his Japanese-American identity in a vivid yet ideologically scripted way. Noguchi, the catalog proposes, is nothing if not Japanese, as these drawings attest. Yet the muscularity, vivid surfaces, and diversity of scale and material on view at the Eagan Gallery have been lost, subsumed into flat cartouches that surely struck viewers at the time as iconic forms of Oriental mark-making. And the artist, along with his works, has become a symbol of the transnational Japanese, the community that had haunted the American-born Noguchi for so long in the writings of the New York critical establishment. The catalog, by taking control of the discourse with the help of Eagan, offers Noguchi's own rereading of his sculptures as characters of a language that make obvious what had always been implicit in the analysis of his work, that he is preeminently a Japanese American. What effect did this self-orientalizing approach to the marketing of the work at the Eagan Gallery have on the critics' responses to Noguchi's work? Did anyone notice that the artist himself had now laid claim to the discourse about his life and work that aligned his practice with Japanese cultural forms? While some viewers might have noted the artist's canny response to the critics' discussion of him throughout his career, his critical intervention in constructing his identity was mostly lost on his audiences. They seem not to have consciously registered his seizing control of his Japaneseness, which since the early 1930s had consistently marked the reception of his art and shaped his reputation. Clement Greenberg seemed to ignore the overt Japanese and Asian references in the work and the catalog, as if to underplay Noguchi's efforts to lay claim to the racialized identity with which he'd been marked from the earliest years of his career. Although Greenberg remarked that Noguchi was one of the most important sculptors of the period, he ignored the sculptor's active embrace of Asian references to focus on questions of taste and artistic facility. And here I'm going to quote from Greenberg. Several things in this show are exquisite, even when they measure 5 feet or more in height. But Noguchi's ability to achieve miniature grace on a large scale is the source precisely of some of the reservations this writer feels with respect to his art. Where is strength? Where are profundity and originality? Noguchi is an ambitious artist who asks to be judged on these terms. Few living artists, here or abroad, are capable of an equal felicity of effect. And given the ends he sets himself, he sometimes comes close to perfection. But these ends are not high enough. They are set within the reach of taste, but require too little exertion, or often a display merely of facility. A facility few can match, but facility nonetheless. For Greenberg, a work like Kronos was the closest Noguchi came to success. Praising this large balsa wood work for its, quote, lack of clarity of the relations of the horns and cusps that hang high up inside its arch, and, quote, the rough finish of its surface, which adds force to its contours. Here was the spontaneity, lack of finish, and muscularity of the best new work that Greenberg wanted, and typically found in the figure of Jackson Pollock. This paper has focused on how Noguchi negotiated his identity as a Japanese-American artist at a time of great social and political change, and through the critical lens of the most important exhibitions and reviews of his work in his career up to that time. In 1946, at a moment of post-war hopefulness, Thomas Hess promoted Noguchi as the embodiment in himself and in his sculpture of a hybrid Japanese-American persona that suggested a more truly democratic melting pot culture for the post-war world. 3 years later, at the Eagan Gallery, he was read differently, even as Noguchi tried to harness his oft-spoken Japanese-American identity for his own ends. Clement Greenberg ignored that aspect of his work and instead foregrounded notions of facility and polish that found Noguchi lacking, and indeed feminized in contrast to the roughness and spontaneity of painters like Pollock. Although the format of the catalog for that exhibition and the ink drawings Noguchi made to illustrate it emphasized the Japanese image of the artist, his alignment with Asian cultural traditions redounded less to his benefit than it had to that of his Euro-American colleagues like Mark Tobey or Franz Klein. Like so many Japanese Americans who, in the eyes of Euro-American citizens of the US, suddenly became more Japanese in the wake of Pearl Harbor to justify internment, Noguchi, at the Eagan exhibition, could not find the right register to give voice to his Japaneseness. If in 1935 he'd been negatively labeled Japanese, by 1949 he had hoped to revise the reception of his art by framing it more positively, in relation to Japanese aesthetics at a time when such aesthetics were all the rage. Yet his efforts to grasp and deploy his identity in this way at the Eagan show worked less well than he had hoped. Instead of being read as the hybrid sculptural actor Hess had posited, the diversity of his work at the Eagan show, coupled with Greenberg's remarks about excessive clarity and polish, was perceived as a fault. He apparently was read as drawing on aspects of a so-called primitive visual language in ways that were not quite primitive enough to express reference to Asian aesthetics. Noguchi's claim to such a language perhaps had too much of an accent that white artists, as in this work by Franz Klein from 1956, could take up in ways that would be read as a successful integration of East and West. A language shot through not just with Asian aesthetics, but with the roughness and force of other primitivisms and forms of spontaneity that would be coded heroic, masculine, and highly individual. The Eagan Gallery show marked a turning point in Noguchi's career. He returned subsequently to the gallery scene in New York, even if the return was bittersweet in light of the show's modest success, critically and financially. Although he was reviewed by Clement Greenberg in The Nation and Howard DeVries in the New York Times, none of the work in the Eagan exhibition sold. The summer after the exhibition closed, Noguchi left New York for India, where he traveled on a grant he had received from the Bollingen Foundation to study temples, monuments, and other ritual sites in Asia and the Middle East. Although Noguchi felt good about the work he'd shown at Eagan, he also recognized once the show was over that it was time to move on, out and away from an art critical establishment that did not fully recognize the value of his work. After the elation and effort that go with preparing an exhibition comes a depression, he confided many years later in his autobiography, attempting to explain what it felt like to see the Eagan show close. One wonders if that depression might have been caused by the tenor of the mixed reviews of his work, especially as he had striven to situate his work in the context of his own hybrid cultural identity. Noguchi accounted for his 2-year absence from New York after the Eagan Gallery show in this way. Following my show 14 years previously, I had gone to Mexico. This time I was determined to get away from everything. The reasons I gave myself were varied. On the one hand, I had over the years developed a horror of the politics of art, the narrow outlook of critics and dealers with their pet discoveries and pat judgments, like the rights attending fashion, advertising, and the stock exchange. I felt myself no part of this and wanted no part of it. His journey to Asia reflected Noguchi's desire to explore alternative functions for sculpture in the post-war context of a more global cultural network. But one wonders whether the politics of an art world that trumpeted universal humanism yet could not recognize value in work that diverged from current ideas about artistic achievement, identity, and what made art American after the war might not better account for his rigorous schedule of international travel in the 1950s. By the 1980s, Noguchi had a reputation as one of the most important American sculptors of the 20th century. And that reputation was created on the international stage when he was selected to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale in 1986. Alana Heiss, the curator, selected Noguchi for the American Pavilion because of his Japanese-American identity. She chose him because she wanted to exhibit the work of an artist, quote, who would symbolize the fact that the contemporary artistic culture was a mosaic woven of many different ethnic groups, unquote. Heiss's choice echoes Dorothy Miller's reasoning for including Noguchi in the 1946 MoMA show. It seemed to Heiss that Noguchi's life and work transgressed all kinds of borders, both personal and artistic, and thus as a representative of the US, he would symbolize the emergence of a borderless world. When he was approached by Heiss and asked if he would represent the US, however, Noguchi expressed suspicion about the reason he had been selected, and he refused her invitation. He reportedly responded to her in this way: "Represent America? I absolutely refuse. Just what has America done for me until now? You don't mean to tell me that you don't know the American government put Japanese Americans in relocation camps because they thought they were enemies? I'm one of the Japanese Americans that were not recognized as being Americans. Please tell me the reason why I should now represent America." His initial reaction to Hess's invitation suggests that the struggles he'd endured in the 1930s and 1940s hadn't dissipated, and the issues he'd faced regarding his art's intersection with assumptions about race and national identity remained just below the surface. In 2004, the United States Postal Service produced Noguchi stamps, as you can see here, to celebrate the 100th year of his birth. But even today, his work and life remain oddly invisible. I see my work as one small step at changing that situation. Thank you very much.
Poston, where were they at that time? And the second question is really about the MoMA show in 1946. He was born in the United States, but clearly, and not 100% Japanese, but clearly has such a Japanese presence. That just seems so soon after the war. Was there criticism either within the art world or out in other factions about the inclusion of someone named Noguchi?
Well, I'll start with question one. Noguchi's parents were not together when he was born. His father was a well-known and quite honored Japanese poet, and his father was living in Japan upon Noguchi's birth in Los Angeles in 1904. Parents were never together after his birth, and in fact, Noguchi's time in Japan, his mother took him to Japan, I think in an effort to try to create a connection with the family, his father in Japan, but that didn't go anywhere. And he, in fact, came back to the United States as a teenager and was enrolled in boarding school and continued his education in the United States throughout that period. So there was not a lot of contact with his father, and his mother died relatively young, and he was then mentored by a series of important patrons for his education, both during high school and then when he was in New York. People he met through some of his contacts in the art world after taking classes at the Art Students League. In terms of the MoMA show, it's a really interesting question. I think that the goal of Dorothy Miller was in fact to push back against the sense of whiteness as defining Americanness in this period. And there were several artists in the 14 Americans who were Jewish artists. There was one woman in the exhibition. Dorothy Miller was actually trying to intervene in, I think, create an image of a kind of multicultural democracy in the wake of the war. I think it was an active attempt to create a different kind of narrative. And in terms of the art world, the Thomas Hess essay was the longest and most extensive that came out about the exhibition, but Noguchi was widely praised at the time for being a really important sculptor. Although a lot of the reviews, if you've done any research in this period, you know that a lot of reviews are about this long and don't really say a lot. That's why the Hess essay is in fact such an important piece of the puzzle. So I think that there may well have been carping, on the side, but nothing that I found in the published realm that would indicate a kind of overt hostility to Noguchi's appearance in the exhibition. In fact, he was often seen, it was kind of a, yay, us, we're America, we're doing the great thing after the kind of racial hysteria that had marked the war. Yes?
I've always been curious, and I never knew myself, so I'm going to ask you, to what extent did Noguchi spoon-feed a lot of the information that Hess wrote?
Oh, I'm sure that there were lots of conversations in the studio. He gave him photographs. I think the photograph from the studio of the bronze Kuros, that Hess mentions, he certainly told him about the post and camp. I mean, the information about Japanese American Relocation Center, Camp Number 1, that's pretty detailed information that most people wouldn't have known about. So there's clearly an effort to articulate a certain idea of what the work meant.
I mean, it just seemed to me that Noguchi was pretty savvy, even though he was very conflicted within himself at times. But he was very savvy about being able to present himself in certain ways that suited him, and the one that resonated after the war was his Japaneseness. It didn't start then. I mean, he went to China in the mid-1930s to learn calligraphy, for heaven's sakes. So I'm just wondering to what extent he was pushing Hess, or Hess was the one who wanted to emphasize this Japanese aspect. Do you have any take on that?
I don't know Thomas Hess. And I never actually got to meet Isamu Noguchi, which is unfortunate. I started the research right before he passed away. And probably I wouldn't have been able to do some of the research I did do because of that, with FBI files and the like. But I think that the reality of Noguchi's understanding that he was constantly being equated, and this in the early 30s, it was really virulent. It was very negative, as that one quote from Henry McBride reveals, but there was much more that was going on that was maybe more subtle. And I think that even at MoMA, you see, as you're suggesting, in a conversation with Thomas Hess, there is a kind of give and take and a negotiation about how the identity is going to be framed. But I think some of the language of Hess articulating that Noguchi carried his exile within him like his skeleton, I think, again, we can think about James Joyce and some of the kind of interests in the 1940s about exile, but the reality of his exile was very much a piece of this, and I think that there was some discomfort. And after that show, and just as a point of information, during the time he was preparing the show and just after, Noguchi was actually called up to go back to an internment camp in 1945. He was under surveillance throughout 1945 while he was in New York. So he knew that he was in a fragile position and didn't have a lot of ability to kind of, critique the dominant narrative. He may have pushed in a certain way to try to bring a more universal emphasis to it, but I think that contextual information, and if you read the book, please go ahead and read the whole book. There's some documentation there that I think gives you a better sense of the tension and difficulty of living in New York in 1944 and 1945 and 1946 for Noguchi and other Japanese artists who were not actually US-born citizens.
Thank you.
Getting back to the topic of public attitudes toward Japanese Americans by 1946, I imagine they would have been informed by knowledge of the gallantry and patriotism of Japanese American men who served in the Army during the war. And I wonder if you saw evidence of active efforts by the government or news media to publicize that fact.
I'm really glad you asked this question, because this is a research question maybe for somebody else to take up. But there certainly was an emphasis on the 442nd unit of the U.S. Army, particularly on the West Coast and in Hawaii, where many of the soldiers were brought from they were brought from the camps themselves on the West Coast. But Noguchi, in fact, in 1946, apparently made a proposal to a colleague he knew from Poston, who was a teacher in Honolulu, for a memorial, a living memorial to the 442nd that would be in Honolulu. I've not been able to find any information about this. I've looked far and wide. I've been to Hawaii. I spent 2 years trying to find. I think there's a major project for someone who wants to try to find out about that. I have a few leads, but what this suggests is that Noguchi recognized and saw and wanted to continue to work to engage with the notion of the Japanese American artists' relationship to a kind of national culture, and to be a part of that culture rather than someone who was essentially alien, even as recognized as a citizen. So that the interest in the 442nd, or he did a lot of work in New York in 1945 and 1946 to help when the evacuees were taken out of the camps, when the camps were closed in 1945, to bring them into New York City and to hook them up with trade unions and other social service organizations to find jobs and housing. So he was actually actively involved in the kind of reintegration of the former evacuees into economic life, economic and social life.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk, and I found that your work is advancing and building on the Bert Winter Tamaki's work, and also Alexander Monroe's work toward her neology, the third mind. My interest is that whenever this direction is, I think it's really hopeful to really challenge the American issue. But at the same time, when you go into the Oriental aesthetics or Oriental sensibility, which Oriental you're talking about, and which perspective of Oriental, because Oriental is such a still general, very broad phenomenon, and that specifically related to the American perception of that time's Oriental, and whose idea of Oriental, I think, should be more identified. And then when you talked about self-Orientalism, I just thought I was interested, because he was self-Orientalizing himself in New York and US audience, but at the same time in Japan, he was really received as a very American in Japan, as profoundly understanding Japan. But at the same time, he's got a very American Japanism or a Japanese idea, especially when you read that biography that his wife, very famous actress, Yoshiko Yamaguchi is her name, but when she was debuting in a Hollywood movie, acting in a Japanese war bride as Shirley Yamaguchi. She's a very westernized woman, born in Manchuria, trained in Russian ballet and so on. Noguchi forced her to wear a Japanese kimono, which she's not comfortable, and then wear that special Japanese tabi, and until her feet really bleed. and she couldn't really perform in that very busy actress's life. But because that Noguchi really thought that is the Japanese woman should be. So I think he himself has got quite a lot of Japanese stereotype ideas, but at the same time self-orientalizing in the US, so he's more a complex manner. So I wondered whether you have idea on how to really dismantle the idea of that Orientalism or the idea of Orient and projected by different person, including Noguchi.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I'm using the term Oriental, I was really using the terminology of the period from the critics. And I apologize if that wasn't made clear enough, because I obviously understand that to say even Asian or Oriental is to talk about an entire, wide range of cultures and places and positions and identities that can't be captured. The discourse in New York, in the art world in the late 1940s, the word Oriental was used all the time. It was the constant refrain. And so that was really where the source of my language came from. With regard to Noguchi's life and career after he left New York in 1949, there's a lot of work that's been done there in terms of his biography, and I'm not trying to claim that he's somehow special and isn't a complex man. I think the fact that he was seen as incredibly American in Japan and incredibly Japanese in the United States, but never quite good enough at either, is actually the exact problem. And one could think about making oneself foreign as a tactic or a strategy for how to negotiate the reality of being constantly positioned and pigeonholed and told who you are and how you are going to be understood. And I think, that is, I do think that Burt Winter Tamaki's work really pushes and is really focused on the 1950s, and Noguchi's work in Japan, and then connections between, American artists in that period, and I encourage people to really take up that work. But my interest was really looking at this moment where Noguchi was at the cusp of kind of launching into this level of the art world within the gallery critic system that was at the level of de Kooning and Pollock and these artists who had made such a splash in the United States. He was in fact exhibited, Jackson Pollock and Noguchi both were written up in Life magazine a couple years apart. Noguchi actually was written up in 1946 at the time of the MoMA show in November, actually November 11th, so that show opening on November 11th is kind of an interesting thing this fall. And at the time, his work was described in Life magazine as Japanese American sculptor shows off weird new works. That was like the title. Whereas Pollock is like, the kind of heroic artist of 1949. So I was trying to really place Noguchi into this world in which the sense of how so-called primitive cultures were being assimilated and kind of colonized by white artists for their own purposes without necessarily reference to or understanding of, and this is a blanket statement, I agree that there's probably levels of knowledge that I'm not giving credit to, but in the main, not necessarily worrying so much about where the work came from or how it might be understood or used in terms of particular cultural context. And when Noguchi did it, it wasn't quite right. And I think that by taking that on and trying to say, you want me to be Japanese? I'll be Japanese, is a really powerful way to think about how one might negotiate the constant pressure to be foreign or American and the tension of being never one or the other, but always somewhere in between. And trying to actually make art in the context of my larger book project that was about changing society. And so the work that I'm showing you here is perhaps more traditional in terms of the work Noguchi did in terms of making large-scale and medium-scale sculptures. But he had pushed the envelope really far in the late 1930s and early 40s, doing unrealized projects that, in fact, were so odd that people, again, ascribed them to him being Japanese or that he was a communist. I mean, so both the kind of levels of foreignness or alienness to American liberal ideology was really powerful. Thank you for your comment. It kind of, sparked a little bit of additional material, hopefully, that people will think about. I don't know what our timing is like.
I do think unfortunately we're out of time in this space, but I invite all of you to bring your questions and join us for a reception in the lobby just outside these doors. And thank you all for coming, and thank you to Dr. Lyford.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.